In 1863, during and after the Civil War, thousands of freed African Americans were confined in a camp at Devil's Punch Bowl in Natchez, Mississippi. Imagine stepping out of bondage with hope in your heart, believing that freedom had finally arrived, only to walk directly into another kind of cage. The Civil War was over, and the Emancipation Proclamation had promised liberty, but for many, freedom was still a dream deferred. They left plantations, fields, and towns behind, carrying little more than faith that a better life was waiting just beyond the horizon. Instead, they found themselves funneled into a deep ravine carved by nature, a place surrounded by steep bluffs and overgrown peach trees. To the outside eye, it looked peaceful, almost beautiful, but for the men, women, and children trapped inside, it became a place of suffering and silence. The Devil's Punch Bowl is not a story that appears in most history textbooks. While other parts of America's past are remembered, debated, and retold, this chapter lingers in shadows. What makes it even more haunting is the contrast between expectation and reality, a people set free by law, but abandoned by society. Inside the camp, hunger gnawed at their bodies, disease spread quickly, and exhaustion crushed the spirit of those who had already endured so much. Freedom had been promised, but dignity, safety, and opportunity were denied. Yet, this story is not only about loss, it is also about memory. The Devil's Punch Bowl reminds us that history is not just what we choose to celebrate, but also what we must confront. Every step taken by those who survived, every family torn apart, and every life cut short still speaks to us today. These voices, though once silenced, rise again whenever the truth is told. To remember them is to honor them, and to honor them is to ensure that such suffering is never repeated. This journey into the past is not meant to darken your heart, but to open your eyes. As we explore the hidden corners of history, we uncover not only tragedy but also resilience, courage, and the unbreakable will of a people who refuse to be erased. Their story is part of the larger American story, one that must be told with honesty, compassion, and clarity. If you believe stories like this deserve to be known, if you want more untold histories brought into the light, then join us on this journey. Give this video a like so it reaches others who need to hear it. Share it with friends and family so these voices are not forgotten again. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this. Together, we can keep history alive, not just the parts that are comfortable, but the truths that demand to be remembered. The Emancipation Proclamation promised freedom, but in reality, Black Americans faced continued oppression, exclusion, and violence. The year was 1863, and for many, the words of Abraham Lincoln's decree carried the sound of a new dawn. It was announced that enslaved men, women, and children in states rebelling against the Union were forever free. The words were powerful, stirring hope like a rising sun after a long night. Families whispered to each other about the promise of walking off plantations, about sending their children to schools, about building homes where no overseer could enter. For the first time, freedom seemed within reach. But words written on paper cannot change a society overnight. As the echoes of celebration faded, reality began to show itself in cruel detail. Newly freed individuals often found that the world outside bondage offered little shelter and less opportunity. Employers refused to hire them, schools turned them away, and neighborhoods shut their doors. The dream of equality quickly gave way to the daily struggle of surviving in a nation that had declared them free but refused to welcome them as equals. For many families, freedom meant wandering roads with no destination. They carried what little they owned, perhaps a quilt, a pot, a Bible, moving from town to town in search of work or land. Mothers carried infants on their backs, fathers led weary children by the hand. They were no longer enslaved, but they were homeless in their own country. Too often, they were met not with open arms but with cold suspicion. Communities feared their presence, worried they would compete for scarce jobs or challenge social order. Violence became a common weapon of control. Freedmen who dared to claim wages or walk proudly in public risked beatings or worse. Groups of men patrolled roads, determined to remind the newly freed that liberty on paper did not mean safety in practice. The physical chains were gone, but the chains of fear and intimidation remained strong. And beyond the threats of violence lay the invisible barriers of exclusion. Laws and customs worked together to ensure that Black Americans remained at the margins. They were steered into the hardest labor for the lowest pay. Opportunities to own land were denied. Political voices were silenced through intimidation or technicalities. Even in northern cities where slavery had been abolished earlier, segregation was the norm. Black children attended separate schools, if they could attend at all. Black men and women were pushed into crowded neighborhoods with little sanitation, little support, and little chance to rise. This contradiction between promise and reality created a wound that spread across generations. Imagine being told you are free, but then discovering that freedom is fragile, conditional, and easily stolen. It is like opening a door to find another locked gate, or reaching the top of a hill only to face a higher mountain beyond it. Yet, even in the face of such disappointment, many refused to give up. Families formed churches that became safe havens of hope. Teachers, sometimes only a step ahead in literacy themselves, began secret classes to pass knowledge to children hungry for learning. Communities pooled what little they had to buy land, to build schools, to bury their dead with dignity. They fought not only for survival but for a sense of humanity that the broader nation refused to acknowledge. But the price of resilience was steep. Poverty was unrelenting. Hunger haunted homes. Parents often faced the impossible choice between feeding their families and standing up against injustice. To resist could mean starvation, but to submit meant carrying the weight of broken promises. Still, through song, through prayer, and through small victories of daily life, they carried on. Consider the paradox: the Emancipation Proclamation was a historic achievement, a turning point in the Civil War and a bold statement of principle. It reshaped the Union's moral cause, framing the conflict as a fight not only for preservation but for human liberty. Yet for the very people it sought to liberate, the proclamation was not the end of struggle but the beginning of a new and complex battle. Black soldiers who joined the Union Army fought valiantly, believing their service would prove their loyalty and earn them a rightful place in the nation's future. They faced enemy fire with courage, yet when the war ended, many returned to communities that denied them basic respect. Their uniforms commanded honor on the battlefield but invited hostility in their hometowns. For women, the promise of freedom was equally bittersweet. They no longer labored under the lash of an enslaver, but many now worked as domestic servants, cooks, or washerwomen, paid so little that survival remained uncertain. They struggled to keep families together in a society that had long sought to tear them apart. Freedom gave them agency, but not security. The story of post-emancipation life reveals a truth often hidden behind triumphant narratives: legal freedom is not the same as lived equality. Laws may open the door, but without social change, without opportunity, without safety, the door leads to another hallway of barriers. This is why the period after the Civil War became one of the most turbulent in American history. Reconstruction tried to offer new rights, but backlash came swiftly, determined to undo every gain. Through it all, the courage of those who endured shines. They built schools where none existed, founded businesses despite sabotage, and carved out communities that would become the backbone of future civil rights movements. Their resilience is the other side of the story, the part that shows not only suffering but strength. The Emancipation Proclamation was a promise. The reality, however, was a reminder that freedom without justice is incomplete, and liberty without equality is fragile. For Black Americans in 1863 and the decades that followed, the fight was not simply to be free, but to be fully recognized as human beings deserving of dignity, opportunity, and respect. That fight would continue for generations, shaping the very foundation of the nation itself. Many freed people migrated seeking safety, only to be forced into camps worse than slavery itself. When the Civil War ended and the Emancipation Proclamation rang through the nation, countless families believed that their journey toward freedom had truly begun. They left behind the fields where they had been bound, the cabins where they had once been confined, and the overseers who had dictated every moment of their lives. With hearts filled with hope, they took to the roads. Fathers led their families with quiet determination. Mothers carried the few possessions they had managed to save, along with children too young to walk the long miles ahead. Songs of faith and whispered prayers accompanied them as they dreamed of building new lives in freedom. But freedom is fragile when it lacks protection. The United States at that time was unprepared, or unwilling, to welcome thousands of newly freed people into its towns and cities. Communities viewed them not as neighbors but as burdens. Jobs were scarce, resources were limited, and prejudice remained deeply rooted. As the tide of migration grew, Union officials decided to establish camps to contain the flow of men, women, and children searching for safety. These camps, intended as refugee settlements, soon became places of despair. Among the most infamous of these was the site known as the Devil's Punch Bowl in Natchez, Mississippi. It was a natural ravine surrounded by high bluffs, its name already carrying a sense of foreboding. Into this space, thousands of newly freed people were herded, their movements restricted, their hopes confined. To the outside world, it might have looked like order, a solution to the overwhelming influx of migrants, but inside, life was harsher than the bondage they had just escaped. The camp's conditions were dire. Food was scarce, water unclean, and shelter almost non-existent. Men were often sent out to perform backbreaking labor for the occupying forces, while women and children remained behind the camp's boundaries with little more than scraps to survive on. Disease spread quickly, carried by hunger and exhaustion. Days were filled with uncertainty, and nights echoed with the cries of the sick and the desperate. For many, this bitter reality was a cruel twist of fate. They had run from slavery expecting liberty, yet found themselves trapped again, this time by the very nation that had promised them protection. Freedom was supposed to mean choices, where to live, how to work, how to raise a family. Inside the camps, those choices were stripped away once more. Instead of overseers on plantations, there were guards. Instead of forced labor for enslavers, there was forced labor for an army. The names had changed, but the suffering felt hauntingly familiar. Imagine the heartbreak of a father who had walked miles with his family, believing he was leading them toward a brighter future, only to watch his children weaken from malnutrition inside the camp. Picture the strength of a mother who tried to keep hope alive for her children even as she buried friends and neighbors in shallow graves. These stories were repeated over and over, thousands of times, in camps across the South. The most tragic aspect was how quickly the world seemed to forget. These camps did not make it into the triumphant stories of freedom that would later be told. Instead, they became shadows, unspoken reminders that the road from slavery to true liberty was longer and more painful than most were willing to admit. And yet, even in such conditions, resilience flickered. Families shared what little they had. Songs of faith rose up in the night air, reminders that spirit could not be confined even when bodies were. Some managed to escape the camps and carve out lives in hidden corners of the countryside. Others endured, believing that survival itself was a form of resistance. What these camps revealed was a truth often ignored, that the transition from slavery to freedom was not a single moment but a long and brutal struggle. Being declared free on paper did not guarantee safety or opportunity. Freedom without resources, without shelter, and without respect could feel like another kind of captivity. The Devil's Punch Bowl, and camps like it, serve as haunting reminders that liberation was not the end of hardship but the beginning of a new chapter filled with its own forms of suffering. They show us that history is rarely simple, and that promises without action can become traps. Today, when we remember those who sought safety and found themselves in places worse than what they had escaped, we also remember their courage. They kept walking, kept hoping, and kept surviving, even when the odds were against them. Their resilience laid the foundation for future generations who would continue the struggle for dignity and equality. The story of these camps is not just about tragedy. It is also about the endurance of the human spirit, the determination to live even when freedom feels incomplete. It reminds us that the journey toward justice is long, but every step, no matter how painful, shapes the path for those who come after. Union troops imprisoned freed blacks inside the natural ravine, cutting off escape and subjecting them to forced labor, starvation, and neglect. The place was known as the Devil's Punch Bowl, a deep ravine near Natchez, Mississippi, whose steep walls formed a natural prison. What should have been a sanctuary for people seeking liberty became a trap where thousands suffered and died. The Civil War had torn the South apart, and in 1863, hope spread among the enslaved. The Emancipation Proclamation had promised that their chains would be broken. Families left plantations behind, believing freedom meant a chance to rebuild lives long denied to them. They walked for days, even weeks, through dangerous terrain, carrying only their faith and the dream of starting anew. Yet instead of welcome, many found themselves herded into the ravine by Union troops who claimed to offer safety but instead created a place of misery. The geography of the Devil's Punch Bowl sealed their fate. Towering bluffs enclosed the camp, rising like stone walls to cut off escape. Once inside, there was no leaving without permission. The land that might have inspired awe became a prison where men, women, and children were trapped. Conditions inside were brutal. Union soldiers controlled all movement, rationed food, and used the men for grueling labor. Some were forced to clear land, build fortifications, or cut timber under harsh supervision. The women and children left behind received little food or care, their survival dependent on scraps or whatever meager supplies the soldiers allowed. Clean water was scarce, and diseases spread quickly through the crowded camp. Starvation gnawed at the weak, while sickness took the young and old alike. It was a cruel irony. The very army that declared itself the liberator of the enslaved had turned around and created conditions that mirrored captivity. The newly freed had believed they were walking into freedom, yet they found themselves subject to another system of control. Forced labor replaced the toil of the plantation. Rations replaced the meager food once given by enslavers. Guards replaced overseers. The faces of authority had changed, but the suffering felt hauntingly familiar. Day after day, despair deepened. Families who had once dreamed of a better life watched loved ones weaken and die. Graves multiplied around the camp, each one a reminder of promises betrayed. Mothers tried to comfort hungry children with songs, but even music could not fill empty stomachs. Fathers who had dreamed of providing for their families were reduced to begging soldiers for scraps or enduring punishing work in hopes of earning an extra ration. And yet, in the midst of such cruelty, there were moments of quiet resistance. Some shared food in secret, ensuring the weakest had a chance to survive. Others whispered prayers in the night, clinging to faith that life beyond the ravine was still possible. For those who managed to escape, survival meant disappearing into the countryside, hiding in swamps or seeking refuge with sympathetic communities. Every act of endurance, every breath taken in defiance of neglect, was itself a declaration of humanity. The soldiers stationed there often justified the camp as a matter of order. They argued that freed people needed to be contained, that chaos would spread if they were allowed to move freely through the countryside. But beneath those claims lay prejudice and indifference. To them, the lives within the ravine were expendable. What mattered was control, not compassion. As months passed, the death toll rose into the thousands. Historians believe more than 20,000 may have perished in the Devil's Punch Bowl, their lives cut short by starvation, disease, and despair. The ravine became a mass grave, its soil enriched by suffering, its silence heavy with loss. Few stories from inside the camp were written down, but the memory lingered among descendants and in whispered accounts that survived generations. The tragedy of the Devil's Punch Bowl reveals a darker side of history often overlooked. It shows that freedom declared by law is not the same as freedom lived in reality. The Union Army, hailed as liberators, failed to provide safety and dignity for those most in need. Instead of support, they imposed confinement. Instead of aid, they delivered neglect. And yet, even as we recount this painful chapter, we must also honor the resilience of those who endured it. To survive hunger, to withstand neglect, to continue dreaming of a life beyond the ravine, this took strength beyond measure. Their suffering was immense, but their spirit carried forward, shaping the determination of future generations to demand the dignity and equality denied to their ancestors. Today, the Devil's Punch Bowl remains a haunting sight. The ravine still exists, its natural beauty hiding the weight of what once occurred there. Trees grow tall, and the land seems peaceful, but beneath the surface lies the memory of lives lost. To stand there is to feel the silence of history, to sense the voices of those who endured captivity in a place meant to symbolize liberation. Their story matters because it reminds us that progress is never simple, and promises of freedom can be hollow without justice, compassion, and true equality. The Devil's Punch Bowl teaches us that liberty must be more than words on paper, it must be lived, protected, and shared. The men, women, and children who suffered there were not just victims of neglect. They were survivors of unimaginable trials, carriers of hope in the face of despair. Their memory challenges us to look honestly at the past and to ensure that the mistakes of history are never repeated. The ravine may have been a place of death, but it is also a place of remembrance, where the courage of the human spirit refuses to be forgotten. Men worked under brutal conditions, women and children were left without food, water, or medical care. The camp at the Devil's Punch Bowl was not a place of safety but a place of struggle, where every sunrise brought new trials and every sunset closed on scenes of suffering. What had begun as a journey toward freedom turned into an ordeal that mirrored captivity in ways too painful to ignore. The men were the first to feel the weight of this harsh reality. At dawn, soldiers summoned them from their families and drove them to fields or construction sites. Some were ordered to cut timber in the heat of the Mississippi sun, swinging axes until their arms ached. Others hauled heavy stones or dug ditches, their bodies pushed past exhaustion. Supervisors shouted commands, showing little concern for the pain of those forced to work. Blisters tore open on hands already scarred by years of labor. The men had dreamed of a future where their work would belong to them, yet here, once again, they worked only to serve others. The conditions were unforgiving. Food rations were meager, never enough to replace the strength drained by endless toil. Fresh water was scarce, and breaks were few. Men stumbled under the weight of logs or collapsed in the dirt, only to be ordered back to their feet. Some endured with grim determination, believing survival was the only way to protect their families waiting inside the ravine. Others felt their hope slipping away with each passing day. Inside the camp, the suffering of women and children unfolded in quieter but no less devastating ways. Mothers cradled infants with little milk to give. Small children cried from hunger, their voices weak from days without nourishment. Clean water was nearly impossible to find, and the stagnant pools that sometimes served as a source carried sickness rather than relief. Illness spread quickly, fevers, coughs, and infections, yet there was no doctor, no medicine, no care. Women bore the heavy burden of trying to keep their families alive in a place designed for despair. They searched for edible roots along the edge of the ravine, or bartered scraps with others in whispered exchanges. Some rationed tiny amounts of food, pretending to eat so that their children could have a little more. At night, they sang songs to soothe restless little ones, though their own stomachs twisted with hunger. Every act of comfort, every attempt to shield children from the harsh truth, was an act of courage. The contrast between laboring men and starving families created a cycle of anguish. Fathers returned from forced work too weak to provide, only to find their wives and children even weaker. Mothers tried to hide the worst of the suffering from their husbands, knowing that despair could break a man as surely as hunger. Families clung to one another, but the camp seemed designed to strip away every ounce of dignity and strength they had left. Disease soon followed hunger. Without clean water, sickness spread swiftly through the crowded ravine. Children weakened first, their small bodies unable to fight off infection. The sight of tiny graves dug near the edges of the camp became heartbreakingly common. Women wept silently at night, trying not to let soldiers hear their grief. Some held their children closer, terrified of losing them to the same fate. Others prayed that the suffering would somehow pass, that the promise of freedom would one day match the reality. Despite the cruelty, there were moments of resilience. Men shared scraps of food with neighbors, even if it meant going without themselves. Women formed small circles of support, caring for one another's children when someone grew too sick to continue. Songs rose in the evenings, quiet but determined, carrying faith across the ravine. These small acts of humanity pushed back against the harshness of their reality, reminders that spirit could endure even when bodies faltered. Still, the suffering was immense. The forced labor drained the men until many could no longer work, their strength broken by long days and little food. Families inside the camp dwindled, some entirely erased by starvation or disease. Each life lost was another promise of freedom betrayed, another voice silenced by neglect. The tragedy of these conditions was not only the suffering itself but the silence that followed. The stories of women who cradled hungry children, of men who gave their last strength to brutal labor, rarely appeared in official accounts. The camp was remembered not in triumph but in whispers, its truth passed down quietly through families who bore the memory of loss. To understand the camp is to see both pain and perseverance. The men who worked under brutal conditions did not give up their humanity, even when stripped of choice. The women and children who endured hunger and illness did not lose their spirit, even when denied the care they desperately needed. Together, they represent a chapter of history where freedom was promised but not delivered, where resilience was the only shield against despair. Today, when we reflect on the lives lived and lost at the Devil's Punch Bowl, we must remember not just the tragedy but the strength it took to survive even a single day there. Men forced to labor, women struggling to feed their children, children enduring hunger and illness, they were not only victims of neglect but also symbols of endurance. Their suffering should never have happened, yet their spirit carries forward, reminding us of the cost of broken promises and the importance of justice that is real, not just spoken. The Devil's Punch Bowl remains a quiet landscape now, its ravine filled with trees and silence. Yet beneath that calm lies the memory of men, women, and children who suffered within its walls. To tell their story is to honor their endurance, to ensure that their pain is not forgotten, and to carry forward the lesson that freedom must be more than words. It must be lived, protected, and shared by all. Disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion killed over 20,000 people in a single year, with bodies often buried where they fell. The Devil's Punch Bowl became not only a prison but a graveyard, where dreams of freedom were silenced beneath the soil. What should have been a new beginning for thousands of freed people turned instead into one of the darkest chapters of their lives. The ravine itself seemed to conspire with fate. Steep walls enclosed the camp, cutting off air and light. The summer heat of Mississippi turned the ground into an oven, baking the weary as they struggled for survival. When the rains came, water pooled in the low ground, mixing with waste and disease. Each season brought new torments, and the people inside the camp had no means to defend themselves against nature or neglect. Disease spread quickly through the crowded ravine. Without doctors, medicine, or even clean water, even small sicknesses became deadly. Fevers burned unchecked, coughs deepened into something far more dangerous, and infections from small wounds claimed lives in days. The children were the most vulnerable, their small bodies unable to withstand the waves of illness. Mothers held them close, desperate to protect them, but helpless against the invisible enemies that swept through the camp. Malnutrition worsened every illness. Rations were never enough, small scraps of bread, sometimes a bit of salted meat, often nothing at all. The men who worked under harsh conditions burned through what little food they were given, leaving their bodies thin and weak. Women and children received even less, forced to survive on hope and determination more than nourishment. Faces grew hollow, ribs became visible, and strength faded with every passing day. Exhaustion took its toll as well. Men forced into labor returned each evening to the ravine too tired to stand, their muscles trembling, their breath shallow. Without food or rest, their bodies broke down. Some collapsed in the fields where they worked, never rising again. Others staggered back into the camp, only to collapse by the side of their families, unable to move another step. Exhaustion was more than fatigue, it was the slow surrender of life itself. As death became constant, the camp changed. Grief became part of daily life. Families dug shallow graves when they had the strength, but often there was no time or energy to do more than cover a body where it had fallen. The soil of the Devil's Punch Bowl became filled with those who had once carried the promise of freedom. Each unmarked grave was a broken dream, a voice that would never be heard again. The sight of so much loss weighed heavily on those who survived. Mothers buried children, children buried parents, and husbands buried wives. Grief came quickly, with little time to process or even mourn. Survival left no room for ceremony. Tears fell quietly, but life in the camp demanded endurance, and the living carried their sorrow silently, even as their own bodies weakened. Despite the overwhelming tragedy, moments of resilience shone through. Families clung to each other, offering comfort when nothing else could be given. Songs were sung at night, soft and mournful, carrying the voices of a people refusing to let despair silence them completely. Shared prayers whispered into the dark offered strength, binding together those who still held on to hope that freedom, true freedom, might one day come. The numbers tell part of the story, over 20,000 lives lost in a single year, but numbers alone cannot capture the depth of human suffering within that ravine. Each person who died had a name, a family, a dream of a future beyond chains. Each loss was not only a statistic but a stolen chance to live in dignity. The scale of death was so great that the land itself became a memorial, even without markers or monuments. Outside the camp, the world moved on. The war continued, armies clashed, and politics shifted. Yet within the Devil's Punch Bowl, time seemed to stand still. For those trapped inside, survival was measured not in victories or proclamations but in the ability to endure another sunrise. The voices of the suffering rarely reached beyond the ravine, drowned out by larger events, but their silence remains one of the most haunting reminders of promises broken. The Devil's Punch Bowl teaches us that freedom without care is no freedom at all. Liberation was declared, yet without food, without water, without protection, the newly freed were abandoned to conditions that ended tens of thousands of lives. The ravine became both a symbol of hope denied and a graveyard for those who believed in it. Today, standing at the edge of the Devil's Punch Bowl, one might see only trees, silence, and the beauty of nature reclaiming the land. Yet beneath that beauty lies the memory of suffering. The ground holds the remains of men, women, and children whose cries were never answered, whose lives ended far too soon. The silence of the place is heavy, as though the earth itself remembers what happened there. To tell their story is to give voice to those who could not speak. It is to honor their endurance, even in the face of hunger, sickness, and exhaustion. Though they were left to die, their memory should not be left to fade. The tragedy of the Devil's Punch Bowl is not only about loss but about resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit clings to hope. The 20,000 lives lost are more than numbers, they are a call to remember, to reflect, and to ensure that such suffering is never repeated. Their story remains with us, carried by the land, by memory, and by the quiet strength of those who survived to tell it. The Devil's Punch Bowl is not only a ravine in Mississippi, it is a monument to both tragedy and endurance, a place where the cost of broken promises is etched forever into the soil. Unlike Nazi concentration camps, this tragedy has been largely erased from mainstream American history. The story of the Devil's Punch Bowl is not one that fills school textbooks or is often spoken of in classrooms. It lingers instead in shadows, whispered among descendants, recalled in fragments, and carried forward by those determined not to let it vanish entirely. Yet for most people, it is a story they have never heard, even though the scale of suffering rivals some of the darkest chapters of humanity's past. The irony lies in how history is remembered. Great pains have been taken to preserve the memory of atrocities committed abroad, and rightfully so. Monuments, museums, and lessons exist to ensure future generations never forget. But closer to home, a tragedy that claimed tens of thousands of lives on American soil has been pushed aside, its memory left to fade. While entire nations vow never to repeat certain horrors, this chapter of American history is often met with silence. Why is it that the Devil's Punch Bowl is not a household name? Part of the answer lies in discomfort. The story challenges the idea of the Civil War as a clear battle of good versus evil. It complicates the narrative that the Union Army, hailed as liberators, always stood on the side of justice. It reveals the uncomfortable truth that those who promised freedom could also create suffering on a massive scale. For many, such contradictions were easier to bury than to confront. Generations grew up learning of emancipation as a triumph, of the war as a turning point in the march toward equality. Yet the Devil's Punch Bowl shows that the road to freedom was neither immediate nor simple. To acknowledge it is to admit that liberation came with betrayal, that the newly freed were often left without shelter, food, or dignity. It forces a reckoning with the reality that freedom on paper did not always mean freedom in practice. The absence of this story in mainstream history is also tied to race. For centuries, the voices of Black Americans were systematically silenced or ignored in the telling of the nation's past. Their struggles, their losses, and their resilience were often omitted or diminished. The Devil's Punch Bowl is one of many stories where the suffering of Black communities was erased, not because it lacked importance, but because acknowledging it would mean confronting the nation's failures. And so, the land itself became the only witness. The ravine remains, its walls standing as silent guardians of memory. Beneath the soil lie the remains of over 20,000 men, women, and children who once believed they were stepping into a new life. The earth remembers, even when people do not. To walk through the area today is to step onto sacred ground, though there are no markers to tell visitors what lies beneath their feet. Yet silence does not mean absence. Among descendants, stories survived. Families carried the memory, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in whispers, but always with reverence. The truth endured in communities that refused to forget, in oral histories passed down from generation to generation. For them, the Devil's Punch Bowl is not an erased history, it is a wound that never healed, a reminder of what their ancestors endured in the pursuit of freedom. In recent years, more voices have begun to call for recognition. Historians, local leaders, and descendants have urged that the tragedy be studied, acknowledged, and remembered. Some have spoken of creating memorials or museums to honor those who died. Others have simply asked for the story to be told, for the silence to be broken, for the Devil's Punch Bowl to take its place in the nation's collective memory. The comparison to Nazi camps is not made to diminish one tragedy or elevate another, but to highlight the selective nature of remembrance. The world has learned the importance of never forgetting certain atrocities, and yet it has allowed others, especially those that happen to marginalized people, to fade into obscurity. Both deserve to be remembered, because memory is not about comparison but about truth, healing, and responsibility. The erasure of the Devil's Punch Bowl also teaches us about the power of history itself. What we choose to remember shapes our identity as a people. To omit suffering is to deny the humanity of those who endured it. To forget is to risk repeating mistakes. By hiding this chapter, generations have been deprived not only of truth but of the lessons it carries, that freedom must be guarded, that promises must be honored, that human dignity cannot be an afterthought. Imagine if the Devil's Punch Bowl were taught in every classroom. Imagine if children grew up knowing the full cost of freedom, not only the triumphs but the betrayals. The story would teach compassion, humility, and responsibility. It would show that progress is fragile and must be protected. It would remind us that freedom is more than a declaration, it is a duty owed to every generation. Though largely erased, the Devil's Punch Bowl still calls out to us. The voices of the 20,000 are not silent, they echo in the land, in the stories carried forward, and in the conscience of those willing to listen. Their suffering was real, their lives mattered, and their memory deserves the same recognition given to other tragedies. To tell their story is to restore what history tried to erase. It is to honor the men, women, and children who dreamed of freedom and instead found suffering. It is to acknowledge that America's past holds not only moments of greatness but also moments of deep failure. Remembering the Devil's Punch Bowl is not an act of shame, it is an act of truth, a step toward justice, and a promise that those lives will never be forgotten again. Wild peach trees still grow above the ravine, their branches stretching toward the sky as if reaching for something long lost. In spring, their blossoms are soft and delicate, painting the air with a fragrance that masks the sorrow buried beneath the soil. To a stranger, these trees might seem ordinary, just another part of the southern landscape, offering shade in the summer and fruit in the fall. Yet to the locals of Natchez, Mississippi, they are anything but ordinary. They are living markers of a painful past, rooted in the memory of lives cut short. Generations of townsfolk have passed down the belief that the peaches owe their richness to the remains of those who perished in the Devil's Punch Bowl. It is said that over 20,000 freed men, women, and children were confined there during and after the Civil War, their bodies left in shallow graves when disease, starvation, and neglect claimed them. As the years turned to decades, the soil absorbed their presence, and from that soil the peach trees rose. Their fruit ripens each year, full and bright, but locals refuse to eat it. To them, the peaches are not gifts of nature, but reminders, sweetness born from suffering. Imagine a child growing up in Natchez, hearing this story for the first time. Perhaps it is told by a grandparent, sitting on a porch in the late afternoon, the air heavy with humidity. The child listens wide-eyed as they are told of the tragedy that unfolded just down the road, in the ravine where wild trees now grow. The tale is not one of fairy tales or folklore, it is history, and its weight is felt in every word. The child is warned never to touch the fruit, never to taste what carries the memory of sorrow. And so, the tradition continues, decade after decade, generation after generation. For outsiders, this refusal to eat the peaches might seem like superstition, but for the people of Natchez, it is reverence. It is a way of acknowledging the suffering of the ancestors who found no peace in life and were given little dignity in death. To bite into the fruit would be to dishonor them, to pretend that their pain had been forgotten. And so the peaches fall to the ground each year, uneaten, their sweetness left to the earth, their scent a quiet memorial. The trees themselves have become silent witnesses. Their roots dig deep into the ravine, weaving through layers of soil that hold the stories of those who once dreamed of freedom. With every passing season, they stand as reminders that history cannot truly be buried. The land remembers even when people try to forget, and it speaks in subtle ways, in blossoms, in branches, in fruit no one dares to touch. In many ways, the wild peaches capture the essence of the Devil's Punch Bowl's legacy, beauty intertwined with tragedy, life growing from the memory of death. The trees are not cursed, but they are sacred. They remind us that the past does not vanish simply because it is painful to confront. It lingers in the landscape, in the soil, in the air, waiting for those who will listen. The refusal to eat the peaches has also become a symbol of resistance. It is a choice not to turn tragedy into consumption, not to turn memory into something casual. Instead, it is an act of quiet remembrance. The peaches remain untouched, and in their untouched state, they preserve the dignity of those who never had the chance to live free. For visitors who learn this story, the ravine takes on a different meaning. What might first appear as a natural landmark becomes hallowed ground. The peach trees are no longer just trees, they are living memorials, each branch whispering the names of the forgotten. To stand before them is to feel the weight of history pressing gently on the present, urging us not to look away. The story of the wild peaches also raises questions about how we remember. History books often leave out the Devil's Punch Bowl, but the land itself refuses to forget. The trees bloom every year, carrying with them the memory of lives lost. They remind us that remembrance does not always come in monuments or written records, sometimes it comes in the quiet refusal to eat, in the whispered warnings of elders, in the silence of falling fruit. As the sun sets over Natchez and shadows creep across the ravine, the peach trees stand tall, their branches swaying in the evening breeze. They hold a truth that cannot be erased, that freedom, for many, came at the cost of unimaginable suffering. The people who avoid their fruit do so not out of fear, but out of respect, for the lives that nourish the land, for the ancestors who endured, and for the hope that their story will never be completely silenced. In the end, the wild peaches are more than fruit. They are symbols of remembrance, living proof that the earth carries memory even when human beings try to look away. They bloom year after year, asking us to pause, to reflect, and to honor those whose voices were once silenced. And though their sweetness remains untasted, their meaning grows richer with every passing season. Even beyond the punch bowl, the struggles of newly freed people did not end. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation had promised freedom, but what followed was a life shaped by uncertainty, hardship, and the heavy weight of systemic barriers. For thousands who left the confines of slavery, the road ahead was filled with challenges that tested both their resilience and their hope. Many families, once freed, found themselves with no land, no money, and no resources to build new lives. They carried their freedom like a fragile lantern in the darkness, precious, but always threatened by the winds of circumstance. Towns and cities offered little welcome, often closing doors to opportunity while opening gates to poverty. In rural communities, the promise of independence was replaced by the reality of sharecropping, a system that bound freed men and women to the same fields they once worked under bondage. Sharecropping was supposed to be a partnership between landowners and workers, but in practice, it was another trap. Families were given small plots of land to farm in exchange for a portion of their harvest. On paper, it offered autonomy; in reality, it locked them into cycles of debt. Landowners inflated prices for seed, tools, and housing. At the end of the season, the share that remained for the workers was so small that survival, not prosperity, became the only goal. Year after year, many found themselves owing more than they earned, bound once again, this time by contracts and accounts instead of chains. Alongside poverty came violence. Freed families lived with the constant fear of attacks, intimidation, and laws designed to strip away their newfound liberty. Night raids, threats, and sudden bursts of brutality were reminders that the fight for freedom was far from over. Communities of freed people built schools, churches, and businesses, but their progress was often met with hostility. Success could invite resentment, and safety was never guaranteed. Even when freed men sought to participate in the democratic process, they were met with obstacles. Laws and regulations were crafted to exclude them from true citizenship. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation at voting stations ensured that their voices were silenced before they could echo in the halls of government. Though the Constitution promised rights, reality delivered barriers. Citizenship on paper did not mean citizenship in daily life. For women, the struggles carried another layer of hardship. They bore the responsibility of raising children in conditions of poverty while also working in fields, homes, or makeshift businesses to keep families alive. They carried the memory of generations past while trying to prepare the next generation for a future that seemed uncertain. Their strength was often the only shield families had against despair, but the weight was immense. Children, too, felt the sting of this incomplete freedom. Schools were scarce, often run by communities themselves with little funding or support. Many children grew up with limited opportunities for education, their futures tied to the same fields and debts that had ensnared their parents. Dreams of advancement existed, but the paths were narrow and lined with obstacles. Yet even within these struggles, there was resilience. Freed people built churches that became centers of strength, both spiritual and communal. They formed networks of support, pooling resources to build schools or to help families in need. They celebrated their culture, their faith, and their survival, even when society tried to erase or diminish them. Their existence itself was an act of resistance, a declaration that they would not disappear quietly into the pages of forgotten history. The story of life beyond the punch bowl is not just one of oppression, but also one of endurance. Freed people endured systemic poverty and inequality, yet they continued to build, to dream, and to demand recognition as full citizens of the nation they had helped to shape with their labor and sacrifice. Every church bell that rang, every classroom that opened, and every ballot cast in defiance of intimidation was a step toward the vision of true freedom. Still, the weight of systemic injustice cannot be ignored. Poverty, sharecropping, racial violence, and exclusion from citizenship left deep scars on generations. These struggles shaped the foundation of American society, influencing not only the lives of those who endured them but also the course of history itself. The promise of liberty remained, but it was a promise constantly deferred. To understand this chapter is to see freedom not as a single moment in time, but as a long and ongoing struggle. The Civil War ended chains, but it did not end oppression. The Emancipation Proclamation ended ownership, but it did not bring equality. True freedom required more than words on paper, it required justice, safety, opportunity, and dignity, things that remained elusive for many. Even in the face of overwhelming obstacles, freed families kept moving forward. They planted seeds, both in the soil and in their communities, believing that one day, the harvest would bring something greater than survival. They carried stories, traditions, and hope, passing them down so that future generations would know both the hardship and the resilience of their ancestors. Their story is one of unfinished freedom, of a journey that continued long after the first chains were broken. It is a reminder that the struggle for equality did not end in the 19th century, but stretched far beyond, leaving echoes that still reach into the present. And above all, it is a story of strength, the strength to endure, to resist, and to hope, even when the world offered little in return. The story is a stark reminder of America's long history of racial violence and the need to remember these hidden chapters to ensure justice and equality today. When we speak of the past, we do not summon it simply to linger on sorrow or despair. We bring it forward because it still has lessons to teach, truths to reveal, and voices that must be heard. The tragedy at the Punch Bowl, and the struggles that extended far beyond it, show us that freedom without equality is incomplete, and liberty without justice is fragile. For generations, entire communities lived with wounds that were not only physical but also deeply spiritual. Families carried stories of hardship, whispered from one generation to the next, even as larger society chose silence. These silences, intentional or not, create gaps in collective memory. And in those gaps, injustice can take root again. That is why remembrance is powerful. To remember is to refuse silence. To remember is to protect truth from being buried beneath convenience or denial. When we look back at these hidden chapters of history, we are faced with uncomfortable truths. Yet it is precisely in facing them that we discover a more honest version of ourselves. By acknowledging the injustices that shaped the lives of so many, we gain the clarity to see where echoes of those injustices may still exist today. Memory, when honored, becomes a compass. It guides us, warns us, and helps us navigate toward a better future. The story of the Punch Bowl is more than a tragic moment locked away in the 19th century. It is a mirror reflecting the unfinished work of justice. It asks us to question, how do we define freedom? Is it a legal declaration, or is it the lived reality of safety, dignity, and opportunity? For the thousands who suffered, the answer was clear: freedom declared but not delivered is no freedom at all. Their lives remind us that progress requires more than promises, it demands action, vigilance, and compassion across generations. We cannot change what happened, but we can choose how we carry its memory. We can choose to silence it, allowing the story to wither in forgotten corners, or we can choose to bring it into the light, honoring those who endured, and ensuring their sacrifices shape the path forward. History is not only about victories, monuments, and celebrations, it is also about reckonings, about listening to the silenced and recognizing truths that were ignored for too long. By telling these stories, we also honor resilience. Even in the harshest conditions, people endured. They dreamed of futures better than their present. They created families, built communities, and left behind legacies of strength that continue to inspire today. Their will to survive was an act of defiance, their hope an act of courage, and their memory an act of resistance against erasure. This is why remembrance matters. It is not about reopening wounds, it is about healing them with honesty. It is about seeing the full picture of history so that we do not fall prey to repeating its darkest moments. When we remember, we create the possibility of building something stronger, justice that is not partial, freedom that is not conditional, equality that is not postponed. The Punch Bowl, and the countless other hidden tragedies across the land, call on us to stand as witnesses. We are the inheritors of their stories, and with that inheritance comes responsibility. Responsibility to speak, to teach, to learn, and to continue the work of bending the arc of history toward justice. The lives lost, the families broken, and the communities shattered must not fade into shadows again. Their story belongs in the light, and by sharing it, we make sure it endures. And so, as we close this chapter of remembrance, let it serve not as an ending but as a beginning. A beginning of deeper understanding, of sharper awareness, and of renewed commitment to justice in our own time. The past cannot be undone, but the future is still being written. Every step we take toward equality, every act of compassion, every moment of truth-telling is a way of honoring those who came before. If you believe stories like this must be told, if you believe memory is a form of justice, then help us keep these voices alive. Like this video so it reaches others who may not know. Share it with friends and family so that conversations continue beyond this moment. And subscribe to our channel to join us as we uncover more hidden chapters of history, stories that deserve to be remembered, honored, and carried forward. Thank you for being part of this journey of remembrance. May the voices of the past guide us toward a better tomorrow. And as you close your eyes tonight, may you rest in peace, knowing that even in the quiet of night, truth continues to shine. Good night, and we will see you in the next story.